Hi students, today we're looking at Unit 3, Note 3, Resisting Slavery. You can find Resisting Slavery notes on pages 6, 7, and 8 in your packet. It takes up a lot of space just because there's important people and then the events that they're connected to, but it's not necessarily more writing. 6, 7, and 8 in your notes. Okay. People resisted slavery, and the people who wanted to get rid of slavery were called abolitionists. The abolition movement was made up of blacks and whites who wanted to abolish or end slavery. The American Anti-Slavery Society, started in 1833 by William Lloyd Garrison, campaigned for the freedom of slaves, and many abolitionists aided runaway slaves. So your first vocab word that you need to know is the abolition movement. And that is the growing numbers of people who were speaking out against slavery. Most Northerners had never witnessed the conditions of slave life on Southern plantations. Former slave Frederick Douglass worked with the American Anti-Slavery Society to spread the truth about slavery. Douglass had been taught by his owner's wife to read and write as a child. He escaped, and he later bought his freedom. Douglass wrote his autobiography and started an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. He also traveled the country speaking about slavery. So Frederick Douglass is our first person that we're going to look at, and he's an escaped slave, a speaker. He published an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. So one of the events, I believe it's on page 7 of your notes, is the abolition movement. And this is the movement of people who wanted to abolish slavery. And they spread the news of slavery through speeches, rallies, newspapers, and books. Another way that people tried to resist slavery was through rebellion. At times, resistance to slavery turned violent. In 1822, authorities in Charleston, South Carolina learned that Denmark Vesey, a free black man, was planning a large slave revolt. He was arrested along with 30 others and hanged. And that was actually in your Brother Future movie that Denmark Vesey was planning this rebellion throughout the movie Brother Future that you watched. In 1831, Nat Turner led 70 slaves on a brutal rampage through Virginia, killing 57 white farmers. Turner was captured and hanged as well. So Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner both leading rebellions. So Nat Turner led a rebellion of slaves, killing 57 whites in 1831. Southerners were already fearful of free blacks stirring up trouble among slaves. Because of Vesey and Turner's rebellions, more Southerners were terrified, and pro-slavery leaders used these events as proof that blacks belonged as slaves. The panic and fear caused Southern states to pass more strict slave codes, to tighten owners' control over slaves, and provide harsher punishments for slaves. So those rebellions really backfired because it instilled a lot of fear and panic among the Southern people. So for the rebellions on page 7, Denmark Vesey, unsuccessful revolt in 1822. Nat Turner led a bloody rebellion in 1831, and Southern states panicked and passed more strict laws for blacks. Another way that people resisted slavery is the Underground Railroad, and some of you are familiar with this already. There were thousands of runaways that escaped to free states and into Canada with help from the Underground Railroad. This secret network of people provided transportation and safe houses where runaways could hide. A number of conductors or guides risked their lives to help escaping slaves travel to freedom. Harriet Tubman is the most famous of these conductors. She led more than 300 slaves to freedom on nearly 20 trips between 1850 and 1860. So Harriet Tubman was an escaped slave and famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. Most slaves couldn't read, and any paper maps or instructions could be found, so most messages were spread in creative ways. Songs and spirituals had hidden messages telling the route for escaping slaves. Some women sewed messages into quilts that were hung out at homes along the route to guide runaways to the next safe stop. Lanterns and candles left in windows offered a sign of safety and help along the way. So, an important vocab term, Underground Railroad, on page 6. A secret network of free blacks and whites who helped thousands of slaves escape to free states and to Canada. So, your Underground Railroad, I think that's on page 7. Secret network of free blacks and sympathetic whites helped thousands of slaves to escape to free states and into Canada. They used signals and codes to alert travelers of safety and danger. And there were secret codes in songs and quilts, helping give directions to freedom. So far, we have the abolition movement, we have rebellions, and we have the Underground Railroad. So the next resistance to slavery that we're going to talk about is Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is a book. In fact, it was the most famous Civil War era literature in um, in all of America. It was first published in an anti-slavery newspaper in 1851, and then it was published as a novel in 1852. The author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, was a 40-year-old wife of an abolitionist pastor. So you do need to know that the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin is Harriet Beecher Stowe. So why is this book so famous? This book is so famous because it brought the horrors of slavery home to Northerners. Okay, it stirred up the emotions about slavery. Also, in the South, her novel was hated. It was cursed um, because it made millions of people who hadn't thought much about slavery before more upset and angry about the cruels of slavery in the United States, the cruelties. So she brought to light what the actual slave experience was like, and most people didn't really know or understand that. And she brought that information to the masses, and it caused quite the uproar. Uncle Tom's Cabin was originally published in newspapers. It was published as a complete novel in 1852. It opened people's eyes to the brutalities of slavery, and it was hated by Southerners. Another way to resist slavery was through raids. So John Brown, who's pictured there, was an abolitionist. He traveled from state to state looking for jobs and working to oppose slavery and help runaway slaves. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, some pro-slavery supporters came into the Kansas Territory from Missouri. We're going to talk more about the Kansas-Nebraska Act next class. So there were people who basically came into the Kansas Territory from Missouri, stirring up violence and trouble as settlers were voting whether or not to allow slavery in Kansas. John Brown took revenge in Kansas by killing 5 pro-slavery settlers. 3 years after the raids in Lawrence and Pottawatomie, Kansas, John Brown tried to organize another raid, this time in Virginia. So they decided to raid the federal arsenal in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, and he believed that this uprising would inspire an all-out slave revolt. So he planned on supplying weapons to slaves and fighting slave owners together. However, there were no slaves that rushed to join his rebellion, and he was arrested, tried, and hanged for his crimes. So John Brown was an abolitionist. He led violent raids in Lawrence, Kansas, and Harpers Ferry, Virginia. So some examples of some raids. I believe this is on page 8 of your notes. It's the 1854 attack on border ruffians coming into Kansas from Missouri to spread slavery. Trying to start a rebellion in Virginia by raiding the federal arsenal. And John Brown was arrested and hanged. Okay, this picture might look familiar to some of you. This is at Fort Snelling in Minnesota. The debate over slavery reached the Supreme Court when slave Dred Scott and his wife Harriet sued for their freedom. Dred Scott was a slave owned by a Southern military doctor who was sent to Fort Snelling in Minnesota Territory, which was a free territory. When Scott's master died, he went to court to fight for his freedom, since he was living in a free territory. So Dred Scott was kept as a slave in free territory, and he went to the Supreme Court to try to win his freedom. In 1857, the Supreme Court reviewed Dred Scott's case. Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered the court's decision. The court ruled that Scott could not sue for his freedom in a federal court because he was not a citizen. No African American, slave or free, could become a citizen. And the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because Congress did not have the power to make laws for future states and territories. This was a huge defeat for African Americans in our country. To find that they cannot sue or use proper government channels to protest something. Not only that, they could never become a citizen, and they couldn't make laws for future states and territories, so the government couldn't. Congress was trying to say that some states above a certain line would be free and the other ones could decide if they wanted to be free or slave. And basically the Supreme Court ruling here said, no, you can't do that. Every state gets to decide for itself. So what a blow that slavery could possibly spread even more, and they have no rights and they're not citizens. So in 1857, the Supreme Court ruling established that no black person, free or slave, was a U.S. citizen, and that the Missouri Compromise was ruled unconstitutional. And we'll talk more about the Missouri Compromise in the next class. This concludes your notes for Unit 3, Notes 3.